Hi, hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar. We're just going to pause for a moment or so as people join the session and get dialed in. We'll get going in about 30 seconds or so. Please bear with us. Okay, I think we'll make a start. I can see that the attendee number is still climbing, but it's slowed down a little bit. So we'll get started with some sort of introductions and some housekeeping. It'll be another moment or so before we really launch into the meat of the session. Yeah, welcome everybody. This is our new Coffee Time QI webinar series. We're kicking it off with one all about driver diagrams today. And we'll get into kind of the agenda in a moment. But before we do that, just a few bits of housekeeping. We've got 30 minutes on the session today, so it's going to be fairly rapid fire. And a few other bits of housekeeping. Firstly, introductions. So my name is Jason Williams. I'm part of the team here at LiveQI, and I'm joined by my colleague Andrew Stewart, who you'll hear from a little bit later. He's manning the chat and the Q&A side of things during today's session. So please, while we're on the chat, do mention, do get in touch via that. Do say hi, see where you're coming from, which organization you represent, or which city, which country you're in. It's always useful to understand kind of who's online and who's joining these sessions. During the course of the session, we'd love to hear from you. Please use the chat or the Q&A for that. It would be helpful if you've got questions, if you can put them in the Q&A. That will make it a bit easier for Andrew to sort of triage those and us to stay on top of them. But we'll try and address as many of them as possible live during the session. But yeah, any other sort of general comments, please put that in the chat. Another bit of interaction a bit later in the webinar. Andrew's going to launch a quick poll. We've just got one question we'd love you to answer, which is all about other webinar ideas. We'd love to canvass your thoughts on what else we should include in this series. So look out for that near the end. And then the final piece about the webinar is being recorded, as you should have seen when you joined today's session. So yeah, we can't see you, we can't hear you. It's one of those sort of webinars, but the session is being recorded and you will get an automatic email in 24 hours time with a link to that recording. So no worries if you need to drop off early or if you want to share that recording with colleagues who might find this interesting. I think that's about it in terms of the housekeeping. It looks like the attendee numbers leveled off a little bit. Good to see people posting in the chat. So thank you for that. Let's dive in. So quickly, just the agenda before we really get into it. So as I said, today is all about driver diagrams, and the session is meant to be sort of roughly half and half. First half is a bit more about kind of the theory of driver diagrams. What are they? Benefits of using them, techniques for developing them, those sorts of things. And then we'll segue a bit more into the practical side of things, how to make a driver diagram, particularly in LiveQI, in our kind of improvement software, how to build one, some of the features and functionality around that, and how you can link it in with other parts of your project. And then just finish up with some learning resources that we've got all about driver diagrams. So that's the idea of today. Without further ado, I'm going to get stuck in and start talking about, well, what is a driver diagram? It's obviously it's a fairly commonly used improvement tool in a lot of QI projects. We find not every organization uses it as a matter of course, but we have built it as one of the main tools within LiveQI. And for those who are not particularly familiar with it, hopefully today's obviously going to be enlightening. I've got a couple of examples of what a driver diagram looks like on the screen. You're not really meant to be able to read them. There's more just to give you a visual as to what they look like. We'll dive into an example in a minute. But I've got a couple of quotes up here from Dr. Don Goldman talking about driver diagrams and kind of what they're for, and some useful quotes to help summarize this really. A few things to pick apart here. So he talks about being a visual display. Obviously, it's a fairly visual tool, and you'll see that in more detail when we come onto it in a minute. The sort of information that's captured, you could just list out in a long list of sort of bullet points, nested bullet points. But the point here is it's far more visually compelling and easier to understand because of the layout of this sort of information. So that's one thing. But in terms of what that information is, talks about it being as part of the team's theory of what drives or contributes towards the project aim. So the idea is this whole diagram kind of hinges off the aim of your improvement project. What's your objective? What's your aim? And I'm starting to break that down into its smaller parts. So what are the things that we can affect that are going to contribute to the successful realization of that aim of our project? So it's just a really short, sort of useful summary of that. And he kind of goes on to talk about helping a team to understand and plan their improvement aim. And one of the key things here, he's mentioned it twice already, is the team element of this. The best examples of these diagrams are where they've been developed by as much of the team as possible that's involved in this piece of work. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. But yeah, understanding and planning their improvement work. So the idea here, particularly the planning aspect of that, is ideally it's developed quite early on in the project process, really. So before you really start measuring, certainly before you start testing, you should be developing one of these diagrams, because it allows you to clarify the scope of the project to some extent, the sort of things you're going to be concentrating on changing and testing. And so there, as he goes on to say about translating it into a visible set of drivers and changes that underpin kind of trying to achieve that aim. So hopefully that makes some sense. We start to look at an actual example now. Hopefully that come to life a little bit more. Hopefully this is legible. This is one that I've just taken out of LifeQI, and we'll kind of talk through the specific wording in a minute. But I just want to kind of break down sort of the anatomy of the driver diagram to begin with. So we look at it as 4 columns, essentially, kind of moving left to right. On the far left-hand side, you have the aim statement. So this is our project's overall aim statement, and this is always kind of the starting place. And then from there, we move through each of the columns in turn when we're building it, through primary drivers, secondary drivers, and then onto the change ideas. And the idea here is we take the aim and then we look at, well, what are kind of the big things that are influencing that aim? And typically you try not to have too many of these. I've only got 2 on this example on the screen. Sometimes it's more like 4 or 5 or something, but this probably shouldn't be 20 things, or you might find that the scope of your project is just way too large. It's multiple projects, or you haven't really narrowed it down, or what you've come up with aren't really primary drivers. They tend to be secondary drivers. That's something I'll kind of come back to. But yeah, how do you distill that aim into a few major things that really affect or drive or influence whether that aim is realized or not? That's kind of your primary drivers. And then you take it down a level in terms of detail, split out each of those primary drivers into some more detailed components, really. So we can see in this example at the top, we've taken on 1 primary driver and we've got 3 sort of sub-elements to that, 3 sub-drivers, basically. And then from that point, we can then start to go through what are our slightly more specific ideas for things that we could actually change. So we're not really talking in the drivers columns about changing anything necessarily, not explicitly in the wording, but when we get to the change ideas, yeah, these are our more specific ideas of things we could change. And typically then these would lead into the PDSA cycles that you would run, where you start to really test out these ideas or go into more sort of specifics. So hopefully that explains kind of just the high level structure of it. The example I've got here isn't a real quality improvement project from some hospital. It's a fairly simple, almost a more personal example that's often used in teaching just because it's quite easy to understand. The aim here being about weight loss. So the aim is to reduce weight by a certain amount in a certain time period. And it's quite a helpful example of just illustrating how you go about designing one of these, because what influences the weight, say this is me, well, it's to do with the calories consumed, how many calories I consume, and the calories that I burn. Fairly simplistically, there are 2 things that majorly influence kind of my weight. You could split it out into other things and maybe get a bit more detailed, but it's fairly nice, big handfuls that allow me to sort of then break this diagram into more helpful kind of component parts. So I think about the calories I'm consuming. I can then think of that in terms of the type of food and drink that I consume is one thing here, secondary drivers, but also then the frequency and timing of that, and also the volume of food and drink. So it's allowed me to start to get my sort of train of thought going in different areas all around food and drink. It's not just one big subject, it's kind of breaking that down into things like volume, frequency, and type. Similarly with calories burned, type of exercise, volume and frequency of exercise, other kind of daily habits. It just allow me to sort of split that out. So when it comes to change ideas, I've kind of got almost more things to hang those ideas off rather than just the aim statement, what might affect the aim. I've got these sort of more bite-sized component parts, if you like, that I can then come up with some ideas for. So the idea of working left to right, and then thinking about type of food and drink, I can then come up with some ideas of how I could change things and try and make sure that those ideas tie back to something that's going to influence my aim statement. So things like consuming less sugary and high processed foods seems like a fairly sensible one, but at least I can show that there's a link between that through the different drivers back to the aim statement. And I can now come up with some PDSA cycle ideas for how we might test these different ideas, basically. So yeah, that's a very sort of simplistic version of that. This isn't one of the biggest driver diagrams we've ever seen. Often in live QA, you see some that are really quite tall, primarily because the list of change ideas can get massive. And that's something to think about when creating these in terms of the scope of the project and how thorough, how broad you want to go, basically. I'm going to keep going through for the moment, a bit more on the sort of the theory side of things. So yeah, what's the point? What are the benefits of creating one of these? The three main ones that we tend to talk about are what we've got listed on the page here. So firstly, deconstructing a complex problem. My weight problem, or what I want to do with my weight, isn't necessarily the most complex thing in the world, but even that driver diagram allows you to see you can break that down into quite a few different components, and that wasn't everything you could have listed on that in terms of secondary drivers. So even a simple thing like that can get really quite a big driver diagram. But it's quite an effective way of deconstructing what could be a really big, ambitious, complex aim. How do we distill that down into some more bite-sized elements that we can come up with some strategies for changing and testing, basically, and allows that to be nicely sort of step by step as well. So that's a really helpful tool. Also provides focus and ensures alignment. We've sort of mentioned this already a few times. So the idea is that if you're coming up with ideas, all too often in a project, we've got this big aim, and people are very quick to come up with ideas of what they think the solution is. And then you kind of need this translation bit in the middle, which says, okay, there's this idea. How does that tie back to the aim? Is that the best idea? Are there other ideas that might have a bigger impact that maybe align with more of the drivers? So it kind of just allows you to keep focused on making sure that the ideas that you're going to take forward and test have got some logical link back to kind of that aim statement. And it also allows you to kind of set a bit of a scope in terms of the project. As I mentioned, some of these can get huge, these driver diagrams. And if you kind of want to limit the scope of your project to the things you can control, perhaps influence, then that's going to essentially limit how big these things get. And if you use it to sort of set that scope, these are the drivers we can affect. These are the ideas we are interested in, capable of taking forward. Then it stops people from going off and coming up with weird and wonderful other ideas that might help, but don't really fit within the sort of the scope of the project. So that's really helpful. And then lastly, representing this complex strategy. So it's helped us deconstruct that problem and come up with a list of ideas. And by setting that list of ideas and that sort of using it as setting the scope of the project in some ways, it's then quite a powerful tool to explain what we're trying to do to other stakeholders in the organization. So you can see how we've dissected this problem. You can see how we've set the scope. You can see these are the ideas that we've got. And you can then do things like color coding it to show areas of progress or areas of completeness or status against the different change ideas or drivers and things like that. There's a number of different ways you can then begin to kind of annotate and illustrate the driver diagram. So it's really helpful, just communication tool for other parts of the organization as well. Okay, move on to, skipped over that one somehow. The last sort of bit more on this kind of the theory side of things was more about the techniques for developing driver diagrams. A bit of a busy slide here, but just a few things I wanted to kind of highlight. First of all, saying that this is best done as a team. I mentioned that a couple of times already. And even though, one person might be the expert on this subject, all too often we find that the more people you can get involved in creating one of these driver diagrams early on in the project, the more holistic the kind of the set of ideas and the viewpoints will be, as to the things that are going to affect that aim, the things that you can influence and control within this kind of the scope of the project. So would definitely recommend it as a team exercise as early as possible, rather than getting too far through the project and realizing that you've missed some perspectives on how the project should operate. The next one there, start with a SMART aim. I'm sure everyone's heard of SMART aims, but on the left-hand side, we've kind of listed out that SMART acronym. It's very important that that's as smart as possible, basically, and that's really going to, again, help set the scope to some extent of the project, and allow you to really evidence whether you've met that aim or not by the fact that whether it's smart or not, basically. And then what falls off from that is that you work left to right from these driver diagrams. It doesn't work so well if you've come up with a list of ideas and you're trying to sort of reverse engineer them back up to the aim. Really, you kind of don't worry about the change ideas and all your smart ideas to begin with. Start with the aim and try and break it down step by step, working left to right. That certainly works the best. Next up, post-it notes to your friend. Every time I've been involved in building one of these, it's not as simple as, okay, I've got it all in my head and I can just sit there and write it out. You will inevitably be chopping and changing it around. One of the most common things I've seen is you come up with what you think are your primary drivers, suddenly realize you've got about 8 of them, and on reflection, they're not really the primary drivers. They're more likely to be a number of secondary drivers there. So you kind of need to shift them over and think, what are the more common elements that sort of summarize some of these, so I can get to a more distilled set of primary drivers. And so for that reason, a lot of kind of moving around, it's really helpful to use post-it notes. A couple of crude photos up here or where people have done that, sticking them to the door in the office or things like that, or on a bit of flip chart paper where you've maybe set your drivers and they've done that in pen, and then they've got loads of different post-it notes for kind of the change ideas. In that kind of early formative stage, it's really helpful to be able to do it in that sort of way where you can move it all around, basically. But then lastly, once you've got a good version 1 of that driver diagram, we would strongly recommend capturing it on LiveQI. And in a moment, we'll segue on to how to do that. But as I've described, it's a really powerful sort of communication tool for not just for the team that are working on the project, but for others outside of that as well. So it's no good at just being post-it notes on the back of the office door or a bit of flip chart paper that soon gets lost. You want to capture it somewhere that it can easily be shared, included in reports, downloaded, all of those sort of good things, so that it's more accessible to others. So what we're going to do now is start to transition into LiveQI itself and look at how this is done. Just before I do that, I'm going to pause. Andrew, any questions that have come in so far that you want me to pick up on?
One question that just came in is to how to identify drivers and change ideas. It's kind of what you've mentioned already. So yeah.
Okay, good question. Let me go back up to here. I think it's an interesting question. I guess one of the things that I sort of mentioned here is partly it's almost like a wording thing. If you look at the secondary drivers I've got, it's things like the type of food and drink, the frequency of something. I'm not necessarily phrasing them as specific changes. I'm trying to keep them a bit more as, I don't know how you describe them, almost like categories of things. And then from that, the change ideas might be, they're more specifically worded around changing something. And I might be, if I pick on type of food and drink, there could be quite a few ideas that link back to type of food and drink. I've kind of combined sugary food and processed foods here, but I could have another one that's, cut down on carbs or something like that, those sorts of things. So it's trying to keep anything that's really about the kind of the change into that change idea column, and trying to be a bit more streamlined in thinking of the secondary drivers as sort of categories of things. But I don't know there's any particularly great sort of scientific answer to that. If you like, it will be a little bit of trial and error, and you might find as you have a go, it's going to affect the number of ideas or the number of secondary drivers that you've got, and that will start to make you realize, actually, maybe I've got too many, I've got some ideas in this secondary driver column, or vice versa, basically. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And there's one more question.
Sure.
which is at which stage of model improvement can I effectively use a driver diagram? And how do I decide whether to use a driver diagram versus other tools?
Sure. Okay. Let's start to pick that up. We segue into Life QI now, conscious of the time, so kind of keep sort of moving through. Those that are brand new to Life QI, I'm not going to go into a detailed introduction to it. It's the web platform we've got for running improvement projects. I'm going to dive straight into a project we've already got set up to help kind of build out the driver diagram. I'm not going to show starting a brand new project, but essentially I have begun to charter a project all around losing weight, which is kind of the example I used in the slide deck. So I've got some of the charter information here, and the way that the project's laid out in Life QI, which is around model for improvement, we have this general page, which captures a lot of the charter type information, problem A and rationale, those sorts of things. The next page that you would come to would be the driver diagram. So kind of referring back to as early as possible in the process around the project, you would be building out this driver diagram before you maybe measuring things, certainly testing anything under PDSA sort of cycle side of things. So it comes quite early on, ideally. And I'll walk you through and how we would do that now. So yeah, linking into our driver diagram page. I haven't built it yet, so I'm going to do that now. So it says I need to edit the driver diagram to start adding drivers. So there's edit button up here, which means essentially put it into edit mode. I can now make a whole bunch of changes, build it out, and then save that, and it's going to be safe. I can't accidentally do anything to it once it's in kind of view mode. So having clicked it into to edit mode, I've got that aim statement, which is kind of copied through from the general page, and I've now got this plus symbol. So to start building this out, what did I have before? Just click on the plus and it will pop up a box for you, and it will draw the line and it will start to space it out. I'm just going to quickly build out a few bits of this just to sort of show you. So yeah, to build other primary drivers, you go kind of back up to the aim statement, click plus, and it's going to draw a primary driver for you. Now I want to move on to my secondary drivers. I go back to the primary driver that I want to hang this one off and click the plus, and it's going to draw that box. Type of food, maybe I had another one, which was, let's do one more down here. Yeah, it's that straightforward. You click the plus now to, if I want to hang a change idea off this secondary driver, I would click plus there. Nice and easy to kind of work from left to right and build that out fairly quickly. I'm not going to go through the process of building out the whole one now. It's going to be a bit of a waste of time on today's session, but that shows fairly quickly how you can kind of move from left to right and build that out. Once I was happy with that, that was my version 1. I just click save and it will kind of flip it back into the view mode. See, it's a bit more condensed now, and I've got the beginnings of that driver diagram there on the page, and I can come back to that at any point. The rest of my teammates have got access to that now because it's on my project, that sort of thing. In order to show you a few more of the features to do with the driver diagram, flip over to this one that I did create earlier. And there's some other aspects that you can kind of really help to kind of illustrate what's going on. One of the things here is choosing a color. So it just being black and white, perhaps a bit boring or not that interesting. I go down to the bottom of the page, I've got this prompt here where I can manage colors, and I can now essentially pick colors and label them. So people do this in all sorts of different ways. I'm going to pick a couple of colors. Just for the purpose of today, I'm going to do it, kind of separate them into 2 different types of colors. And now I can go back up here and choose a color. And I want all of the stuff to do with calories consumed to be blue. You can just click on these and make them all blue. Quickly, let's do a few more of these down here. Nice and easy. Scroll back up, click save, and again it will go back into that sort of more condensed view. And didn't color all of them there, but you can see how it would make it quite easier to sort of digest based on the kind of coloring. Some people color them by columns, color them by themes, or kind of primary drivers. Totally up to you how you do that. But that's quite a helpful way of helping people kind of understand and digest that diagram. And you've got the label down the bottom there. One of the other things you can do, jump into another example that we've got here, is once you've set up kind of the other elements of your project, once you've got some measures and charts, once you've got some PDSA cycles, which are defined in these separate pages, as you're creating those things, you can link them back to your driver diagram. So if I look at this driver diagram, I can see the aim statement has got one measure linked to it. This one's got a measure, this one's got a measure linked to it. If I click on that, I can see the name of the measure that's associated with this particular driver. It's pretty helpful. In a similar sort of way with the change ideas, I can see this one has one PDSA ramp linked to it, two PDSAs linked here. So I've got that idea of where I'm measuring things related to drivers and where I'm already testing things related to ideas, or perhaps I can see that I haven't tested anything to do with new beds yet, but I've got two PDSA tests in here. And if I click on that driver, it will give me that information. I can see those different PDSA cycles and click into those to actually open them and read them. So that's really quite helpful and quite powerful. We are starting to run out of time, so I'm going to show you a couple of features very quickly to do with the driver diagram in here before we wrap up with some resources. One of the other buttons we've got up here is the history. If I click into that, I can see all the previous versions of the driver diagram, who changed it, when it was changed. If I click into them, I can see how it's changed over time, kind of see the drivers changing or the colors changing. So you've got this kind of automatic audit log, if you like, that's built up over time. So it's much easier to see it evolve than if it was just pen and paper. And the other thing is, if you want to get a copy of this out to send it around to colleagues or include it in a presentation, you can go to Actions and you can click Export, and it will give you an image file of that driver diagram. So that's just nice and simple way of getting that driver diagram out of LifeQI, basically. I'm going to pause again for questions quickly, Andrew, before we start to wrap up with the learning resources and things.
I've pretty much answered them. There was a few questions around, what a change score means, which I've answered in the chat. Another question was, would you only include change ideas that you can achieve realistically, or would you just not have those on the driver diagram? So
yeah, that's a good question.
So yeah, so I've pretty much answered that in the chat. Is a practical intervention aimed at improving and identifying drivers. So once you've pretty much pinpointed those key drivers, the next step is then being able to design and implement those strategies and enhance them using those smart goals that Jason mentioned earlier.
Great, thank you. Just going to segue back to, I think should be our last slide, a bit further down here, with some learning resources. Hopefully Andrew can share those in the chat as well, but we've rattled through that fairly quickly. We've got a lot more information online that's freely available for people, both just through our website and through our blog. We cover a whole series of different topics. We've got a whole series of articles all related to driver diagrams, which you can get to. There's 6 or 7 different articles all about different aspects of driver diagrams. We've got an area of our help center to do with talking you through how to use driver diagrams in LifeQI. So kind of going through what I've just shown, but in a bit slower. So that's really helpful. And we've also got another webinar that we've done in the past that was both about driver diagrams and PDSAs. Again, a bit more detail on the features and how to use them in there. And then lastly, just a link back to our webinar page where we've got the different advertisers, all the different webinars that we've got coming up, as well as links to view previous ones that have been recorded and are available on YouTube. So I'd recommend checking out that as well. I think we're about up on our half an hour. Felt like I had to go through that fairly quickly to get through just about everything that we had on the agenda. Hope that was helpful. As I said, look out for the recording to come out in 24 hours, and we look forward to seeing you at one of these next month. I think will be the next one of these CoffeeTime webinars that we run, but there is also another more general introduction to LifeQI webinar happening later this month, which you can join if you're available.
Yeah,
okay.
And we're running the poll at the moment. So it's going up quite quickly. So it's great if you guys can quickly answer our poll that we have going at the moment, just around the webinar topics and what will really help you guys moving forward. So I can see that going up quite quickly. So yeah, thank you everyone for doing that. If we could just give it a few more seconds. It's going through there rapidly. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Those who haven't answered the poll, please do answer.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone. I guess if anyone's got any burning questions they want to ask us, then the best email to get a hold of anyone here is help@lifeqisystem.com. That's help@lifeqisystem.com. That'll come through to our support team and they'll forward it on to the relevant person. So if you've got any burning questions, please do reach out through that email address. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, everyone.